good friend and a writer with Elizabeth Stanton. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mrs. Jenkins?
Yes.
Good to
Ms.
see you.
Jenkins.
Ms. Jenkins. I apologize.
No problem. Pleasure to meet
We
you.
were rather fussy about calling people by their first names when we didn't know them very well, so at least I got that part of it.
I know you very well.
Yes. Well, shall we tell them how we know each other?
Well, I'm all ears to listen to you.
Well, Ms. Jenkins is the great, is that right?
Yeah.
Granddaughter of the woman whom we celebrate today. So it's lovely that you are here.
Thank you.
to honor
Pleasure.
her
If
as
somebody
a
can move a little closer so you can hear her here, you can do that.
Am I too far away? Are people having trouble hearing me?
Yes. Yeah,
Oh dear.
they're way in the back.
Shall I move?
Yeah, why not?
Is there a microphone?
There is a
She's got to project.
Assuming that all of you know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, along with Lucretia Mott, founded, whatever you want to call it, the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848. The third one was held in 1852 in Syracuse, New York. 3 days of events. And the next day in the Syracuse Star newspaper, they wrote an apology to the reading public for having exposed and given publicity to the mass of corruption and heresy, revolting nonsense, and ridiculous vulgarities that the women for 3 days had vomited forth. This was my first convention. I had just had my first child in 1848, and the second one was in New York City in 1850. But I lived in Fayetteville, New York at that time, and I was able to go. I had my youngest daughter, Helen Leslie, who was named after my mother, Helen Leslie Jocelyn. I had her in tow, and off we went to Syracuse. I was rarely grateful for the skirts that we wear, but I was grateful that day because my knees were knocking with excitement as well as trepidation. And we went and we listened, and she was a very well-behaved little girl. And I knew nothing about parliamentary procedure. I knew nothing about speaking, public speaking. I had made one speech to what they called a promiscuous audience. You know what that is. Promiscuous audience means mixed men and women. Doesn't mean what I understand. They tell me it means today when I've said that word. And that was when I was 17 years old. And it was I gave a lecture at the institute that I attended, the Clinton Liberal Institute, and it was on astronomy, or as we called it, the geography of the heavens. So that had been 9 years before. And here there was a crowd of strangers, and nobody could hear me, as it turned out. But for Lucretia Mott, who welcomed me so kindly and so sweetly, and my heart has ever turned to her in gratitude for that welcome. And a young woman in the audience objected when she said that my remarks should be entered into the record. And Lucretia Mott said, why are you objecting? And she said, because nobody could hear her. And Lucretia Mott very sweetly said, all the more reason. And that was my introduction to Susan Anthony, who also was the first, it was the first convention for her too. I don't remember exactly where I met Elizabeth Stanton, but it might have been in a party at the Van Shakes. Do you ever remember hearing this story?
No, I'm sorry.
Well, it was a big party, and it was hosted by Mr. Van Shake, and he knew who I was and what my points of view were, and so he read a poem about Rufus Chubb, and it rather, what's the word, pilloried? That's not quite the word I want, but it made fun of women like myself, and I was a young woman. I had my points of view, but I was still not accustomed to what would come later, because this was very mild. But I very politely listened, as everyone else did, and then at the end, I went over to him, and I pretended to set a laurel wreath upon his head, and I crowned him the immortal Rufus Chubb. And everyone laughed, and the rest of the merriment for the rest of the evening rested on him. And so Elizabeth Stanton loved to tell that story about me. And it's possible that that is the first time that we met. Her meeting with Susan Anthony when she was introduced by Amelia Bloomer has been immortalized in a statue at Seneca Falls. But you may not have heard of me, or if you have, not very much about me, because unfortunately I had no children who wanted to write about me, and I begged my son-in-law, a man named L. Frank Baum, I begged him to write about me, and he always said he would, but they tell me that he never did. Instead, he went on to write some books that got great acclaim, or so they tell me, and I guess I have to be content with that. But I also have been told that both Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton and their people who wrote their biographies rather excluded me, and it wasn't surprising because it was pretty much the story of my life. But during my lifetime, we were known as the Triumvirate, and it was the three of us, rather against the world, or at least our part of the world. Central New York was quite a remarkable place because, as I said, Seneca Falls was the birthplace of the women's rights movement per se, and so many of us came from this part of the world. Both, well, Susan Anthony was born in Massachusetts, but she moved, her family moved to Central New York. Elizabeth Stanton, as you know, was born here, right here. I was born in Cicero, and you will know. Does anybody else know who Belva Lockwood was? Belva Lockwood was the first woman to, well, the second woman to run for president. We didn't talk about the first woman very much. You'll have to look her up elsewhere. But she was the first. Belva Lockwood was quite a remarkable woman. She was born, I believe, in a place called Royalton, New York. And she was married young to a farmer and had a child and a daughter. And then she was widowed. And she decided she wanted to go on, be educated. And so she left her daughter with her parents. She went, got her degree, her undergraduate, as they call it, degree. And then she decided that she wanted to be an attorney. Maybe it's possible, I don't remember the chronology, it's possible she decided that a little later, but at any rate, what she decided was she wanted to move to Washington, D.C., and she did, and taking her daughter with her. And then she decided, that's it, that she wanted to be an attorney. And she went to law school. She was one of two women, and she got her degree, but she didn't get her diploma. And that bothered her, because how can you practice? How can you open an attorney's office without a diploma? So she wrote 2 letters to the president of the law school. One of them was a very polite letter, and the other one, which she wrote almost immediately after, was not very polite. And basically it said, are you not the president of this institution? And if you are, then why not send me my diploma, because I earned it? And if you are not, then why not say that? And she didn't hear anything for a couple of weeks. And then the diploma arrived with no attached message from the president of the school, whose name was Ulysses Grant. So he knew who she was from that point. At some point, she decided that what she needed to do was to be able to appear before the bar of the Supreme Court. And as it turned out, does anybody know why she couldn't just do that? Precisely. Precisely, she was a woman. And a friend of mine once wrote a lovely Lily Devereux Blake, who was very active in our movement, once wrote a little parable about that, about the wise old owls sitting on the court. And I believe a chicken came, and there were some other birds that came, and everything was all right. And then the chicken came, and they said, out, out, out. You can't be here because you are a female. And Lily Devereux Blake wrote that because that was what happened to Belva Lockwood. They said, you may not practice. In fact, there's a law against it. You may not practice in front of the Supreme Court because of the liability of your sex. That's verbatim. So Belva Lockwood never met an obstacle that she couldn't overcome. So off she went, and she got both Congress and the Senate to pass a law relieving women of that burden. And then she went and practiced in front of the Supreme Court. And she found an attorney who was up and coming, and he wanted to practice before the bar too. He wanted to come before the Supreme Court, and he was a man of color. So she broke that barrier for him just en passant. She did go on to be a candidate for president, and I had the signal honor of being one of her electors. She didn't get a lot of votes, but I actually can say that I sat in the Electoral College because of Belva Lockwood. She ran once again, but I did not engage in that. But in 1884, I thought it was a wonderful thing for a woman to run and to remind people that even if we could not vote, we could serve. I spoke twice before committees in Congress. I met twice with President Rutherford B. Hayes. I served as every kind of officer you can imagine in the National Woman Suffrage Association for, maybe 30 odd years. We founded that after the Civil War. I had already been working in concert with the other two for a number of years, and then the Civil War came and we all suspended all of our activities. But perhaps you don't know that there was a very interesting effort made by women during the Civil War, and not poor women or marginalized women, but women of prestige and power. They were all wives of senators and judges and attorneys. And does anybody know what they did for the war effort? They decided not to buy foreign goods. They eschewed those goods for the duration of the war, thus returning a lot of money into the coffers of this country. And they did it with the latest technology. Anybody want to guess what that was?
Newspapers.
No, more advanced than newspapers, have been around for a long time. Telegraph. Yes, telegraph, exactly. They telegraphed all over the country to one another and organized this massive effort, all on their own. So that was one of the things that women were able to accomplish without power. After the war, there was a division in the abolitionist movement about the way women should go about achieving suffrage for themselves. And there were women who thought that Frederick Douglass and others were right in saying that men of color should get the vote first, and we women should wait. And others who said, no, we've come this far together and we should stay together. But Frederick Douglass made a good point. I didn't agree with him, but he made a good point, and he said, when women are hunted in the streets, when women are pulled out of their homes and hung from trees, when women are deprived of their rightful places in society, then they should get the vote first. But this is what is happening to men. And so there was a rift, and not a very pretty one either. Some people said some things that they should have regretted later. And the women's movement, as it was, divided itself into two organizations. So here we were on the left, Elizabeth Stanton, Susan Anthony, and myself, Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And on the right were Lucy Stone and Abby Kelly Foster and Henry Blackwell, Lucy Stone's husband. Lucy Stone had been a very active member of the abolition movement. When she married Henry Blackwell, there was a great deal of fuss because she never changed her name. And people didn't like that, but she stuck to it. And they had a daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, who became the next part of the next generation of suffragists. And by the way, if anybody ever says anything about suffragettes, you can tell them that that was considered a very demeaning term because it had the diminutive ending of E-T-T-E. And the British women used that, but we were suffragists and we did not use that. So at the end of it all, we divided. We had William Lloyd Garrison on our side, and we became the National Woman Suffrage Association, and they became the American Woman Suffrage Association. And it went on like that for decades. We felt that it was imperative for women to get the vote through a constitutional amendment, and that is what we worked for. We also felt that women should run our organization and only women, whereas they thought we should go state by state, and Henry Blackwell was a very important part of that organization. He also was known to say that if we got the vote, then women could vote for things that we, on our side of things, did not always approve. And one of those things was temperance. There was a temperance, I think, from what I have heard, was people don't understand what a big part of our life temperance played. Temperance was a very important issue during my lifetime. And in the end, it was a very contentious issue because many Christians thought that, well, temperance, liquor was the devil, and they wanted to make sure that that was eliminated, and they thought that if they joined forces with the suffragists, then they could get enough votes to vote in temperance. But there was a very large, different sort of thinking. Frances Willard, who came along in those days, I thought she was the most dangerous woman in America. She became the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she also was very active in a clerical movement to change the Constitution to say that this was a Christian country and Jesus Christ was Lord and Master over the United States. And I wrote an article which I called it, or I gave a speech rather, that said, called The Dangers of the Hour, and it said, the red flag is out. And if you were colorblind, more's the pity. Because it was clear to me that this was not a good direction for our country, in which our country should head. And that was, fortunately, that never came to pass. But Miss Anthony had no trouble wanting to make peace with those women, the ones on the right. And it had been discussed more than once that we would merge the two organizations. But in order to do that, we had to change our constitution, our bylaws, to do that. And at the time this came up, I believe it was in the late 1880s, that time, I was the chair of the executive committee. And I asked Miss Anthony, who was the treasurer, to send me money. And she didn't send me enough, so I couldn't travel to Washington, D.C. I was living with my children out in the Dakotas. And so I wasn't able to get there for that meeting. And she arranged for a motion to be brought to change our bylaws so that we could merge with the American. And she organized a committee and refused to let anybody who was against the merger to sit on the committee. And so it passed. And then late that night, and she told them that I had given my consent. Nobody who knew me could believe that, but also nobody who knew us could believe that she would lie. So that was what happened, and the merger went through. And you will read in the history books, or so they tell me, that there was a merger, but they never say why. They never tell you that it wasn't completely voluntary. And some women wanted to go back, but there wasn't any going back. So that was the rather sordid history of our part of the movement. And of course, I can't tell you what happened after I died. After that, I went on to create my own greatest work, which was Woman, Church, and State, which caused a lot of controversy and got Mr. Comstock, the censor, very riled up, which made me very happy. I was arrested for voting at some point in there, and that made me happy too, to know that I was still doing my part to rile people up. I think I want to go back in time a little bit and tell you, and perhaps I understand that Lucretia Mott was here a while ago, and I am sorry to have missed her. After that first convention, my heart always turned towards her in gratitude, and I felt that I had come of age the time that I sent her a letter and said, I will be in Philadelphia, and can you recommend a place for me to stay? And not only did she do that, but she invited me to dinner and signed her letter, thy friend Lucretia. And that, I kept that letter always. It was very touching to me. So some of you may have been here when she was here. Are there people here who do not know how Lucretia met Elizabeth Stanton? No, everybody knows how she met?
No.
No? Okay. Very good. So I will tell you. I will tell you that in 1840, there was an announcement that there would be an international world, they called it a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. And they asked for delegates from the anti-slavery associations here in the United States to send delegates. So they did. And Lucretia and James Mott and 3 other women from Philadelphia, all members of the Society of Friends, were chosen as delegates. And Henry Stanton, who was also an abolitionist, was also among the delegates. Now, Henry Stanton was a youngish man, and he and someone whose name I've forgotten, and John Greenleaf Whittier, who was a newspaper man as well as a poet, they all were good friends. And they became a little unsettled, shall we say, by a number of things, and they decided that the abolition movement was moving too far left, too fast, and things should slow down, and so they started another organization. They called themselves the New Organization, and Henry Stanton, as I said, was one of those people. And nevertheless, he and his cohorts were invited to this convention in London, and they all set sail, and he had proposed to Daniel Katie's daughter, and she had refused him, but then she found out that he was going to London, for a convention of suffragists. Well, not suffragists, of abolitionists. And she decided to reconsider, and she married him. Family history.
Johnstown history.
Johnstown history, exactly. So off she went, and it might have crossed her mind that a man who would take a woman to an anti-slavery convention for his honeymoon might be someone you would want to look at a little more closely, but apparently it never did. So she married him, and they got to London, and she was not a delegate. And then they found out that the women could not be seated because of that old liability of their sex. So she had quite a bit of time on her hands, and I believe they were staying in the same boarding house. Is that, you remember that?
No.
But I think that's what it was. And the first boarding house the Motts went to was not very savory. So they went elsewhere, and a number of the people from the convention ended up at this other place. And so Elizabeth Stanton rather fell in love with Mrs. Mott and spent as much time as they could together. And maybe you have heard this story that one about the British Museum. They went to the museum, and they sat outside and talked the entire time and never even got inside. And by this time, Mrs. Stanton was just overwhelmed by Mrs. Mott and her kindness and her acumen and her intelligence, and they became friends. And they said to one another, when we get back to the United States, we should have one of our own conventions. And it took them 8 years, but they stayed in touch. And there was a letter, I have heard, because someone told me, I don't remember whom, that it said that Lucretia Mott said, it must have been Martha Wright. Martha Coffin Wright was Lucretia Mott's sister, and we were friends. And the Wrights lived in Auburn, and so perhaps it was Martha who told me this, that Lucretia had written a letter to someone and had said we had known Mr. Stanton, but we had not met his bride, and now she is like one of our own. So that family clearly took Elizabeth into their hearts, and Mrs. Mott always called her Lizzie. No one else called Elizabeth Cady Stanton Lizzie, but she did, and I think she was glad of it. And she learned a great deal from her, and that was how it came about. It was because the Motts came to Auburn, and when I was talking about women from New York, I did leave out Martha Coffin Wright, and that was an oversight, because not only was she a good friend to me, but she was a wonderful writer, a very funny woman, and a speaker, and a very capable woman, and a very clear thinker. And it is very sad that her name has been so overlooked. So whenever the Motts would come to New York, they would always go to Auburn. And that particular year, 1840, they were invited to the home of Jane Hunt and her husband, who lived, I think, Waterloo. And they Jane Hunt was Quaker, and so they were invited for a tea. And they invited Elizabeth Stanton, who lived in Seneca Falls, and they had met. And Martha Wright and the McClintocks, Marianne McClintock. And they had a tea party at which Elizabeth, or so I have heard, could not stop talking about all the things that were wrong with her life, and because she was a woman. And at the end of it all, they decided that they would hold a convention. And so they said, well, we could do it now. It's summer. Wesleyan Chapel will not be engaged. And so they decided they would do it. They reconvened once to write a declaration, and they got James Mott to agree to chair it because women were not accustomed to chairing meetings. And within a week, it was organized and done. And when they came out of the house, or so I have heard, they could barely see because there was so much dust in the air. All the carriages and wagons were wheeling into town, and they had no idea if they were going to be sitting there talking to themselves or not. And people were just coming and coming. It was quite remarkable. And they got to Wesleyan Chapel, to which you could walk from the Stanton home. And it was locked. But fortunately, was it not her son, her nephew?
Yeah.
Her nephew, who was a seminarian, was agile, young and agile, and able to shimmy up and get in through a window. And the other, so men were useful. And he was not the only one, because we did have James Mott, who was a very, very kind man, very lovely, loving man. And also we had Frederick Douglass, who was a well-known figure by then, and he was a great supporter of women and their rights. So he came to the convention, and because of that, we got a lot of publicity. Some people said, and I agree, that Mrs. Mott also brought a great deal of cachet to that event, but she would never admit it. So that was how we began. There was another convention in Rochester in a couple of weeks, and then they began to hold them more often, and things went on from there. I think perhaps I should stop talking. I'm sure I've forgotten a lot of things. Does anybody have any questions? If you don't ask questions, I'll feel I haven't done my job. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to ask, I have read some about the tea that they had. So my question is, I mean, the Women's Rights Convention is what I meant. So you mentioned that James Mott started out chairing the meeting. So my question is, during the meeting, did women take over at any point to chair the meeting?
I believe that I was not there. I had just had a child, but yes, Mrs. Mott did become the presider after that, and she stayed presiding over conventions until she was, poor thing, worn out, and we didn't want to let her go. But there were so many capable women at that time. I think we all the three of us became presidents of the National Association, of the statewide association. Martha Wright took office, but it was a very small group of us, and not as many as we needed, but there were always always someone to put the shoulder to the wheel when it was really, really needed.
You were living in the Dakotas, you mentioned living in the Dakotas. Was the movement active at that time out there?
Yes, yes, there was stuff, there was always support for suffrage everywhere. Wyoming was the first state to grant suffrage, but yes, there was. But I just remembered, if I have your indulgence, do I have time? One more story. In 1876, this is too good a story not to tell. In 1876, it was the centennial of the birth of the United States. And a lot of terrible things were happening. There was a smallpox epidemic, there was a depression, probably linked. When you have a pandemic, people lose money and can't work, and everything deteriorates very quickly. And there was a great clerical scandal. Henry Ward Beecher, who was probably the most well-known clergyman in the country, it was in the papers that he had had an affair with his best friend's wife. And it was, people told me this is not so different from today. And, but it was quite a bad year for us, and yet the country decided to celebrate. And they were going to do so in the birthplace of liberty, which is Philadelphia. And so they planned a big celebration, and it was chaired by a man named General Hawley. And Mrs. Stanton wrote to him and asked for a few seats for the women on the podium. And of course, that was not in his plan, and he wrote back, and he said he was sorry, and this is verbatim, to decline her slight request. But if the women were able to do that, then everybody would be fussing about 3 or 4 women. They would disrupt the proceedings entirely. And it could not happen. And so, as much as it pained him, he was going to, and he repeated it, deny their slight request. Well, at this point, Elizabeth Stanton and Mrs. Mott were done with that. They did not want any part of it anymore. But she did agree to help me write a declaration of sentiments. And we wrote that together, and we had it printed out, and we had one copy that was, I think it was on a 3-foot piece of parchment. And then we had lots of smaller copies, and there were 5 of us. It was Susan Anthony and myself and Lily Devereaux Blake and Phoebe Cousins, and I think it was Sarah Andrew Spencer. And we all, for different reasons and different capacities, I was the editor of the National Citizen and Ballot Box, which was our organization's newspaper. And Lily was an editor and writer, and Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton had started a paper in New York called The Revolution. And I don't remember how the other 2 got their credentials, but we all were able to get press passes. So we all were able to sit in the bleachers. And we came with our baskets full of the rolled up declarations, red, white, and blue ribbons. And at the very last minute, they had and President Grant was supposed to be there, but he wasn't, so it was presided over by Vice President Ferry. And I always say, when we popped up, they were some ancestor read the Declaration of Independence, and then everybody cheered, and then they were going to introduce Dom Pedro, who was the president or emperor of Brazil, and the band was about to start to play the Brazilian national anthem, and somebody yelled, "Ole!" And we popped up out of our seats and went up, and I handed the large declaration to Susan Anthony, and she presented it to Vice President Ferry, and he said thank you. He had no idea what it was. He looked at it as if it were a snake. But, and then he went paler than he would be when he was dead, and he accepted it. And so we did exactly, precisely what General Hawley said he didn't want us to do, which was to disrupt everything, because nobody knew what was on those papers, so they all wanted them. So people were reaching here and there, and we gathered ourselves and our skirts, and I think we were wearing hoops in those days. It was quite an achievement. And we went up the steps, the bleachers, and then in through there were casement doors, French doors, excuse me, into Independence Hall, and we went through Independence Hall, and we went downstairs, and there was a kind of a gazebo with a stage, and it was very hot, and I held a parasol while Susan Anthony read it for the first time ever. And that was our contribution to the celebration. I had gone to Philadelphia months in advance in order to arrange everything. And it was very difficult. What we wanted to do was we wanted to hold a salon and have people come and sign a book and exchange ideas and meet one another. And I couldn't rent any place because I was a married woman. So finally, I got Susan Anthony to show up. She was always later than we wanted her to be. And she was able, because of her unmarried status, she was able to be a signature. She could sign the rental agreement. So that finally happened, and we were able to do that. And somebody told me recently that book, and what it was a book of sayings. My motto was, there is no greater word than mother, one word greater than mother, home, and heaven, and that word is liberty. Francis Willard always said the three greatest words were mother, home, and heaven, so I said there was one greater. So that was in the book, and Lucretia Mott had a wonderful motto. She always said, and it's interesting, she said something my father used to say, but not quite in such a pithy way. She said, always take truth for authority, and never take authority for truth. And my father more or less said the same thing. He always said, find out for yourself. Even when I was a little girl, and everybody else said children should be seen and not heard, my father, the physician, always said, ask questions. He always instructed our guests to let me ask questions and to answer them politely. And I forgot to tell you that my father was a physician. I acted as his assistant when I was a child, a young woman. And I was refused entry into medical school. And so Elizabeth Blackwell got to be the famous name. And who knows who would have been the third in our triumvirate. So I imagine things happened as they were supposed to. At any rate, that book that had all those mottos in it came home with me to Fayetteville, And someone in one of my audiences told me that it is now at the Syracuse, or the Onondaga County in Syracuse Historical Association, that exact book still lives in that building. And they had it on display a couple of years ago. So that was very gratifying to me that people care after all these years. That book is still there for people to know that women came in 1876 and demanded their rights. Any other questions?
I have two short things to say. Well, first, thank you. I've lived most of my life in Fulton County, but I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and this is kind of a funny story. My family has an ability in math, and I did too. And in high school, I wanted to take mechanical drawing, and the school said, no, you have to take home ec or you can't graduate. So I was kind of reserved, but I told my family, and my aunt went to school, and she said, show me the law. And there wasn't any, so I was the only girl in the city of Newark, New Jersey to take mechanical drawing, and I drew the plans for my own home. The second part is that modern science now knows that eye level, I don't know how to put it, determines how people are treated. And since most women are shorter than most men, that's something we have to think about. How do we make up that difference? I mean, we may not be able to make it up psychologically, but how do we make up the difference? That's one of the reasons we're not treated equally, because eye level determines who's in charge.
High heels.
Stairs. Stairs
Thank you
too.
all.
Thank you.
Bravo.